APUSH History, Lesson 26, The Politics of the Gilded Age. Now, moving into the politics of the Gilded Age, the first thing it'd be useful to do is to define the term, Gilded Age. It's a term invented originally by Mark Twain, and it references the era, as you should recall from your history courses, from roughly 1870 through 1900. The Gilded Age, defined, means something that looks pretty and shiny and beautiful on the outside, but is actually base, shallow, rotten, or corrupt on the inside. And the best definition that I've always provided for my students of the Gilded Age is to consider this time period, politically speaking, to be an era of fantastic corruption. And the reason for this is threefold. First of all, in the post-Civil War era, you had Congress trying to reassert its authority as a constitutional branch of government after the Civil War, when the executive branch, the presidency, had taken so much power. Second of all, with the political balance of power, both parties won elections in a very, very narrow range. The margin of victory in all the presidential elections was 1% or somewhere thereabouts. These were super close elections. This encouraged candidates and presidents to try not to take risks. They were more interested in maintaining what they had versus risking for a political policy agenda, losing votes instead. And then third of all, most every president of this era was dealing with a political or had a political party that was controlling Congress that was not that president's political party. So the opposite party would always take disadvantage of this to obstruct or slow down or stop the agenda of that president. So the result was you had weak and timid presidents during this time period. Now, that being said, this was an era with massive political participation. Today in the United States, if we get 40 to 50% of registered voters voting in an election, if we get over 50% or near 50%, we say, wow, that was a really impressive election with a lot of political participation. During this era, it was not unusual to have 75, 80, 85% political turnout for these elections, a fantastic number by today's standards. Largely this was due to very tightly bound and controlled party loyalty, regional and ethnic identification, and class identification of voters in many ways. So in terms of the way that people were voting during this time, a key element that did turn out the vote in the struggle between Republicans and Democrats was a tactic known as either, depending on what you were calling it, voting as they shot or waving the bloody shirt. This was an era in which Civil War passions and memories still played strong, and the idea of waving the bloody shirt was to try to stir people up to vote for the party that was of their regional identity. If you're Southern, vote Democrat. If you're Northern, vote Republican, because that was the party of your fallen brothers and your comrades in arms in the Civil War. Don't sully their memory. Don't betray their memory and trust by voting for the other party. We also saw ethnic and urban identifications as well as rural ones tying in tightly to voting during the period. The other big issue that drove voting in many ways and participation was the issue of patronage or nepotism, if you will. Patronage is the awarding of political jobs in government to your political allies and friends. Nepotism is a subset of this, where you're giving jobs directly to your family members. So it's patronage by blood versus patronage merely being giving jobs to all of your political allies, whether you're related to them or not. Because of this, you saw high interest in voting and turnout, because the expectation of government in many ways from much of the body politic was, at least the politically active part, was I can use this as a reward and angle to get myself professional stability later on. In terms of the patronage issue, there were two key elements within the Republican Party. The stalwarts, who were pro-patronage in favor of using government as sort of a jobs machine for their party loyalists, and the half-breeds, or so-called mugwumps, two terms mean the same thing, the reforming elements, at least of the Republican Party, that saw this sort of patronage, this job granting, as somewhat corrupt and somewhat leading to bad government. Now, the presidents this period, you can see for your next slide, I've nicknamed them the bearded presidents. They're, if you recall from your history courses, probably not the most exciting bunch to talk about. This may have been in a unit that your instructor either skimmed over very lightly or kind of tried to do as little as possible, because many teachers find, as well as their students, don't find the Gilded Age to be that exciting. I'm going to give you some reasons to see that there's an awful lot going on here that's very important, that's going to hopefully make points for you on the exam in terms of connecting ideas together. And there's more there to the surface, more than what you see on the surface in this era. Rutherford B. Hayes, the first of these presidents, was known, as we'd seen in our Reconstruction review in your courses, had the nickname from some as Rutherford B. Hayes, because he was the terms of his election were somewhat questionable. The Compromise of 1877 allowed him to win the presidency without achieving or earning the popular vote. He won enough of the electoral vote because of a backroom deal, securing him the presidency over Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate who, by the popular vote at least, should have won. He presides over, in many ways, the split of his own political party into this Republican infighting between the stalwarts and half-breeds over what the purpose of governance and what the purpose of the Republicans in power should be. This is going to limit his term in many ways. James Garfield serves as president for a very brief amount of time prior to a presidential assassination. And think about this. With Lincoln's assassination in 1864 and then Garfield's assassination shortly thereafter in the Gilded Age, you have a time period where in the space of 20 to 30 years, you're going to have 3 presidents who are felled by assassins' bullets. William McKinley in 1901 will be the 3rd of them. So there's a lot of shakiness in terms of stability of the government at the executive branch in this cycle or era as a result. Grover Cleveland will be the only American president of this period who's a Democrat, also the only American president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He serves a term as president, is voted out, and then is reelected back into office in 1892 as president. And the key issues you'll see all these people have, Benjamin Harrison being the one Republican that interrupts Cleveland's 2 terms. The key issues of this era, will be the tariff rate, the taxes on imports and what level they should be at, immigration controls, and then corporate regulation in terms of what to do with these new massive business enterprises that we saw in our industry chapter, as well as civil service reform, this tug-of-war or struggle over patronage, and lastly, monetary policy and currency. And these issues are going to really drive the era. And this is why I'm going to argue there's a lot more to this era than simply boring bearded presidents and not a lot of political activity. There's an enormous amount of highly consequential policy decisions that get made during the Gilded Age that we need to go forward into. First, when it comes to tariff rates, in general, the Republicans would have supported a high protective tariff during this time because to do so was going to benefit big business, which the Republicans were gravitating to in their post-abolitionist era. Now that slavery has been abolished, they find a new constituency, if you will. Corporate America liked tariffs or high taxes on imports because it restricted or reduced their competition from foreign commercial goods coming to the United States. Consumers, those tariffs aren't so great for. You will see Grover Cleveland is going to be the leading advocate in this era of trying to reduce the tariff rates during this time. It's what's cost him re-election in the 1888 election as he loses to Harrison over this issue of the tariff. Corporate regulation. You're going to see more and more frustration in this era from the common people with big business because of the vastness of monopoly capitalism during this time. 2 key pieces of legislation that get passed during this time period are the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act. Neither of these acts actually are effective during this period at limiting business because even though they're passed as sort of a sop to the notion of reform, sort of a token to the notion of reform, the government of the United States, particularly Congress and the legislative and judicial branches and the executive branches, are not interested in vigorous enforcement, not during this period. For instance, the loophole of the Sherman Antitrust Act was going to be that in the phraseology of the act, it said that, quote, combinations in restraint of trade will be illegal. Well, the way it was actually perverted or twisted in terms of its use was it was used by the judicial branch and corporate lawyers to argue that a labor union was a combination of workers that restrained trade by striking. So in a bitter twist, for the first 5 to 10 years of its existence, the Sherman Act was actually used by the judicial branch and corporate America's lawyers to prosecute labor unions. It's used as an anti-labor measure rather than an anti-corporate measure to limit the excesses of big business. As far as the Interstate Commerce Act goes, the Interstate Commerce Act was designed to remedy some of the concerns that rural America had about freight rates. The notion of the railroads controlling the country, or is the country going to control the railroads? It was designed to act as a watchdog agency to call for railroad rates to supervise, to make sure that railroad rates were going to be, quote, reasonable and just. That's the wording of the legislation itself. Now, the problem with this is, once again, you could have a whole series of highly paid corporate lawyers for the railroad who could make an excellent case for why anything is reasonable and just. It's almost like calling something fair. Fairness is in the eye of the beholder. What's fair to you in terms of your curfew and the discipline your parents give you is very different than what's fair to your parents when they're giving you that curfew or giving you that discipline. And it's almost the same way with railroad regulation. Lawyers on the other side can make a case. So the act says everything and sort of says nothing all at the same time, which led to limited effectiveness during this era. In terms of civil service reform, James Garfield's assassination is going to be by an office seeker who's frustrated that he did not get a job with the federal government after supporting Garfield. And when he testifies this on the stand, as to this being the motivation for his killing the president, hoping to get Chester Arthur as president, who as a member of the stalwarts of the Republican Party was going to maybe get him this position. Of course, that never happens, but the country is shamed into saying some action needs to be taken. The action that winds up being taken is the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which had somewhat of an effect on American politics. It called for a limited percentage of government jobs, which of course would increase over time, to be gained or received by their future office holders on the basis of competitive examination. So for the first time in American government history, what you know becomes more important than who you know at the federal level in terms of achieving a narrowed percentage. I believe it starts with about 5% of federal jobs, but that number will increase over time. In terms of monetary policy and currency, as we transition towards as we transition towards rural political pressures in some ways, we've got to talk to you a little bit about money. If you've got a dollar bill, get one handy and take one out, because I want to talk about this little piece of paper right here. Now, when it comes to the dollar bill, I feel that as a nation in many ways, one of the ways that we let you kids down is, as a society, we don't teach a lot of classical economics, and this hurts kids on the AP exam because in many ways, students, like many of the adults in our society, know very little about money except how to spend it. And the thing I want to get into right now is a brief little background on some classical economics. What gives this piece of paper value? This piece of paper is not backed by gold in the sense that you can't go into a bank, plunk this down on the counter and say, give me $1 worth of gold, please. If you look at your own dollar or a dollar around in front of you, you'll see in the very fine print up at the very top, it says Federal Reserve Note. This piece of paper then is merely a note, like a note you get from your teacher, a note you get for a hall pass, a note you would pass in study hall. But this is a note that comes from the United States government. And you probably won't be able to see it on my dollar bill, but if you take one of your own out, you'll see in some very fine print, it says, this note is legal tender for all debts public and private. What that means is this note is legally givable for all debts public and private. Says who? The United States of America. So what this is backed by in many ways is the full faith and credit of the United States government. Now, as such, you can change the value of this dollar. What a dollar buys can vary based on, among other things, how many dollars are in circulation, which is why I need to explain to you a little bit about some of the fundamentals of monetary policy and the money supply. If you understand this, then a great deal, the entirety of the arguments of political people in economics and Gilded Age makes sense. If you don't understand this, then these arguments don't make sense, and it's going to be a huge setback to you should you have to write or make a case on why this was such an intense fight during this time period. To begin with, basics of monetary policy. If you were going to have the dollar increase in value, in other words, a dollar is going to get you more. A dollar bought you a gallon of milk yesterday, maybe getting you 2 gallons of milk today. That is referred to in an economic sense as appreciation. Okay. Now, when you have appreciation, prices drop. Follow along now. The idea being each dollar gets you more. Since each dollar stretches further, prices will fall. Each dollar gets you more. That phenomenon is known as deflation. If you were to contract the money supply, reduce the amount of dollars in circulation, you would get these two things right here. You would get an increase in the value of dollar because you would have fewer dollars out there, and as such, that increase in value means a drop in price. Since you've got a lot of people chasing a limited number of dollars, this means that banks and financiers, creditors, could charge high interest rates. If you want money to leverage to finance your lifestyle or finance your business, finance your activities, you're going to pay a higher interest rate because everyone wants that money and there's a limited amount. It's a supply and demand thing. Banks could charge high interest rates. This sort of policy is a pro-creditor policy. Creditors are those with the money giving the money out. So if you have a contracted money supply, the amount of money in those bankers' vaults is worth even more because there's not as much money out there. This is a policy they like. On the other hand, if you are a person who is in debt, a person who needs credit, these policies don't help you at all. What you want to have instead is an expansionist money supply, or an expansionist money policy rather, a policy whereby you were increasing or maintaining at a current level the amount of dollars in circulation. If the money supply expands, as it grows, you've got the inverse of this over here. Each dollar will now buy you less. Since each dollar buys you less, each dollar is less valuable, this is referenced as depreciation. With depreciation, since each dollar doesn't get you as much, prices rise, right? It takes you more dollars now to get the same thing. And that phenomenon is known as inflation. With inflation, since there's easy money, there's a lot of money out there and it's very easy to get. With inflation, you wind up having then low interest rates because this supply-demand thing, we're awash in a sea of paper money or monopoly money, it's very easy to get. These policies are pro-debtor. So depending on what you do with monetary policy, you get a different set of winners or losers. And this explains the political battle lines that were drawn during this time on what people wanted to have happen with the money supply. Two things were going on in the United States during this time period that were going to affect the money supply. First of all, you had an increasing population. And at the same time as you had this increasing population, you also had increasing productivity of this population. So more goods are in circulation, which is going to lower their prices, but more people are in the population, which is going to kind of mean more hands are chasing those dollars. So dollars are kind of difficult to get a hold of at that time. And you've got also bankers and financiers struggling against, common people or lower class people who don't have money to try to dictate and shape this monetary policy.